Okay, everybody, this video, as a forewarning, is just a practice video for the speech I have to do, 20-minute speech for my philosophy class. So, it's got interesting stuff in it, so I figured I'd put it up. And, yeah, so just as a forewarning that, yeah, you might get bored. So, I didn't actually write out the speech. This is going to be very impromptu, creative, spontaneous attempt to try to do this, which is probably a disaster, but whatever. So, alright, I'm going to address everybody like they're in the class. So, alright, here we go. In our class, we've been discussing the nature of freedom and free will, and whether or not we have it, or we don't, and whether or not there are varying degrees of free will. We've described Eric Fromm's definition of free will, of freedom and autonomy. We've discussed Sartre and other thinkers. However, one question that I guess we have been missing out on is, who is it that is free in the first place? I mean, the question, are we free, is all well and good, but there are some philosophies that would rather ask a more fundamental question, which is, who is it that is free? Before we can answer a question about free will, we could instead inquire about the fundamental aspects of human nature. What are we? Who am I? And we think we have this covered. We think we have this covered with many of our thinkers and philosophers. And what is that answer? The answer to who am I? Well, it usually is a subject-object duality. I am a enclosed center, a selfness in a world of otherness. Self and other, the subject-object duality. This is the primary or fundamental basis of most Western philosophy, psychology, and science. And free will is often based upon the belief that we perceive the world out there, and through logic and inductive reasoning, we conceptualize the world in here. And then, through our will, we act upon the world and bring out our ideas into the world. So, that is the definition of free will, as we understand it, as we've understood it in this class. However, I would ask, perhaps there is a more basic description of our human nature than that. Duality. For example, there are alternative views, even quoted by the William James that we've been reading in this class, on something called radical empiricism, which directly questions that subject-object duality. And hold on one second. At this point, I would grab out a quote that I should have had available, and I don't quite have that up right now. Let me see. Oh, I'm lucky. Here we go. So, at this point, I would actually say, here we go. For example, William James, and to quote Ken Wilber on William James, he writes that if you look very carefully, you'll see that consciousness is simply one with whatever is immediately arising, as we saw them for the mountain, for example. You as a subject do not see the mountain as an object, but rather, you and the mountain are one in the immediacy of the actual experience. So, in that sense, consciousness as a subjective entity does not exist. It's not a separate thing that has an experience of a separate something else. There is just one taste in the immediateness of experience. So pure experience is not split into inside and outside. There is no twiceness or no two-ness about it. As James characteristically put it, experience, I believe, has no such inner duplicity. Now this, very simply, is stating that in the immediacy of our experience, right now, there is no subject-object duality. That is something that we give to it. That's something that we conceptualize, that our brain eventually differentiates. So in other words, this differentiation is an abstraction of reality. Not that it is necessarily bad, because we all seem to have it, but the perceiving into what it is the fundamental shift in our understanding of self and other. That there is no real difference between self and other has never really been explored before in the West to a greater degree. Um, so, what does that mean exactly? Well, we can trace these to Eastern philosophy. Buddhism and Taoism both claim that there is a fundamental unity in all things, and that any boundaries or distinctions we make are abstractions. A return to simplicity. Um, Now, we may find this difficult to at first perceive because stating this is an abstraction. I'm just talking to you, and because I'm just talking to you, these are just ideas. But mind you, uh, in the East, they take a more empirical method to try to figure this out, which is why James called this radical empiricism, because he wants you to directly perceive the immediateness of the moment. The moment is just here. Everything just is. There's a sensation of me sitting here, and the light being outside, and the walls, and the rooms, and the tables, and the people, and everything that is just radically is. And now, this is perhaps a different way to see this, because Sartre saw the same thing. He said everything is just being, and it's just there, and there's no connotations to it, there's no thought to it, there's no ideas. We give meaning to things. We have to conceptualize, and that is our freedom that we can't escape. Perhaps it doesn't need to be seen so negatively with such an anxiety, because it's not a negative thing to begin with. Sartre got it wrong, made a mistake when he said, everything just is, and it's violent and it's dangerous. That is giving a connotation to it. So even he mistook his own philosophy and began to impose connotations to the world of being, which everything just simply is. So, if we are just simply being, if there is no real duality between subject and object, are we free? Who is there to be free? We still have a sense of self, but perhaps it is ultimately illusory. Krishnamurti, another Eastern philosopher, threw in another question about this that perhaps we have not asked in the West. If we are constantly imposing and putting down boundaries in the world around us, as Wilbur mentions, then is that even freedom? Even if we are freely choosing to put down boundaries and abstractions and ideologies, are we not bound to our desires, our compulsions, our thoughts, our feelings? Are we not bound to our bias? And if we are bound to all of these things, if we are attached to all of these things that they might say in Buddhism, then are we free? Or are we trapped and stuck in this sort of mess of different ideas and thoughts and feelings? Well, freedom then may not be as we have been imagining it in the West. So freedom may not be the ability to choose. Freedom may be a choiceless awareness, as they say in Eastern philosophy. An ability to not have to choose, to have that still point from which all other possibilities arise. Now, this may seem very abstract, but I remind you again, in the East, we've discovered that they have found ways to do this. Meditation. Contemplative science has been a way of introspection and practice to sort of bring out these deeper layers of consciousness and unfold and explore very directly. So, and these claims come from that state, come from these contemplative states and these traditions that have been practiced for thousands of years. Now, of course, we'd have to go into this and try it ourselves. We'd have to explore these things, both philosophically and empirically, to try to understand them. But they do exist, and they are open for studying. Strongly recommend that we do. Now, in the West, we sort of have a bias towards this sort of thing, this sort of innerness. If we can't outwardly observe something, then it's not real. Or at least, it's not real until we can outwardly observe it. And until that point, we will ignore it. That is to say, reductionism, as it's called, perhaps the bias of modern science, has worked very well for modern science. It has worked very well because we have taken this method of empiricism, exterior materialism, and said,